Chapter 501. Every superpower with a long history had its own style. Style was a fixed thing, and it was also the most obvious label. Such a style would often be reflected in all aspects, such as behavior, dressing, temperament, and even martial arts. The unparalleled explosive power of the Wang family of Beihai was their martial arts style. The Li family and the Lin clan's kendo were the fiercest. The Jianghu family of South America's martial arts defense was the best in the world. In close combat, the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican was invincible. Only powerful forces like the Samsara Palace and the Polar Ground Alliance, which had been established for a short time, did not have their own style for the time being. In a sense, this was also a strong evidence of the lack of foundation. The Shadow Throne had not been established for a long time. Countless internal games and struggles had wasted a lot of time. It was not until the last 100 years that the Shadow Throne had really matured. But Rothschild had existed much longer than the establishment of the Shadow Throne. As the strongest and oldest super-wealthy family in the Dark World, Rothschild also had its own martial arts style. Being with the Shadow, Rothschild's martial arts were not lethal, and its defense was not outstanding enough. But it was extremely weird and unpredictable. With Paul's current realm, which was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm, he could be said to be the strongest patriarch in Rothschild in the past few hundred years. No one dared to despise such a figure. This was also the main reason why no one took the lead to take action, although all the superpowers were present. So in the seemingly incompetent but necessary stalemate, Paul, who had already surprised everyone tonight, once again surprised everyone. Several invincible realm experts joined hands. The elites of all the superpowers were present. Outside was the vast army of Wulan State. In such a situation, Paul directly broke the stalemate and took the lead. King Tong, who had been quietly restraining her sharpness beside her brother, suddenly burst out with all her strength the moment Paul took action. The domain formed by the Shadow Kingdom seemed to tear up the surrounding space. Thick gray shadows twisted wildly and rushed over. In the blink of an eye, they had spread to a distance of hundreds of meters. The twisted shadows swept past Paul and enveloped the surroundings. Paul's figure, who was striding forward, flickered for a moment and then disappeared. In an instant, at the forefront of the Heroes Club, Mitchell's hair stood on end. Everyone, ah! Just as his voice rang out, an incomparably shrill scream suddenly rang out behind him. A large amount of liquid splattered behind Mitchell. It was incomparably viscous. The night rain in the air was incomparably cold, but this liquid was so warm, so scarlet and sweet. A vague silhouette appeared behind Mitchell. The moment the outline appeared, the bodies of the two thunder-shocking realm experts of the Heroes Club who were closest to Mitchell suddenly burst into large pieces of flesh and blood. These two people were obviously not the targets of Paul's attack, but two obstacles. In the shadow, his figure was extremely blurry, but he tore the two thunder-shocking realm experts into pieces at an extremely fast speed. His speed didn't slow down at all, and he directly stepped into Mitchell's domain. Invincible realm? Paul suddenly spoke, seemingly a little surprised. Mitchell was not famous in the Heroes Club. He could only be considered an ordinary member of the upper echelon. The only thing that made him different was that he was the closest to President Charlemagne. However, according to the secret intelligence of the major forces, Mitchell should only have the combat capability of the Invincible Realm and had not really broken through to the Invincible Realm. In theory, the combat capability of the Invincible Realm could be said to be the top expert of the half-step Invincible Realm. But the moment Paul stepped into Mitchell's domain, he found that it was not the kind of pseudo-domain that was infinitely close to the real domain. It was the real domain of the Invincible Realm. Obviously, Mitchell had completely broken through the natural moat and become a real expert of the Invincible Realm. No wonder, Paul muttered to himself and moved forward again. Mitchell's domain was completely useless. At this moment, Mitchell used his strongest unique skill, but he couldn't stop Paul at all. When he took the third step, the domain around Mitchell completely collapsed in an instant. The vague silhouette of Paul disappeared from his sight. But a huge and deadly danger suddenly came from all directions. Mitchell rushed forward completely out of instinct. His body rushed out at least 20 meters, and he even rolled on the ground in embarrassment. But before he could stand up, in a shrill scream, a large amount of blood rain flew up. In the shadow, Paul's figure was vague and sharp. All the experts of the Heroes Club standing between him and Mitchell, no matter what realm they were in, turned into a rain of blood in the blink of an eye. Before Mitchell could catch his breath, Paul, who was almost completely invisible, had appeared in front of him again. Almost no one in the dark world had seen Paul's real attack. Occasionally, some people were lucky enough to see it, but they all died silently. So no one had seen the shadow slaughter. To some extent, this was the first appearance of the shadow slaughter in the dark world. Any unique skill that could be famous in the dark world seemed to need to be stained with blood when it appeared for the first time. Paul's figure flashed to Mitchell's side. His palm was slightly bent, like a sharp claw that could tear everything. The moment his arm cut through the air, there was a harsh sonic boom. The air was torn apart. When the sound came from behind, Paul's claw-like palm had directly appeared above Mitchell's head. Bang! There was a dull sound, but there was no blood. An incomparably thick black shadow suddenly appeared under Paul's claws. The black shadow squirmed and expanded, directly enveloping Mitchell. Paul's claws rubbed against the black shadow, making a dull sound, and even bringing up a dazzling spark. Paul's eyes narrowed. Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, appeared beside Mitchell. When Paul narrowed his eyes, he picked up the Dark Saint spear that covered Mitchell. The Dark Saint spear, which was famous in the dark world, had completely turned into a mass of liquid that could change constantly during the charging period. As Raphael raised his palm, the shield-shaped Dark Saint spear changed crazily and finally turned into a huge hammer that was 2 kilometers long. Raphael waved the hammer in his hand. Without any nonsense, he smashed the hammer directly at Paul's head. Paul sneered and took a step back. His figure flashed. But the shadow and the pure light lit up at the same time. The unique skill of the Vatican. The light was boundless. In the shadow, countless pure beams of light floated up in an instant. The dense beams of light continued to expand in the shadow, dispersing the shadow. Paul's figure appeared clearly in everyone's sight. Mellad strode forward without hesitation. His eyes were full of seriousness. This was the first time that the shadow slaughter had appeared in the dark world. However, he could clearly see the absolute destructive power of this unique skill. Rothschild and the Vatican were mortal enemies. To some extent, Paul's shadow slaughter was aimed at Arcis. Arcis was very strong. As one of the few experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world, Arcis was best at close combat. In other words, the martial arts of the Vatican were best at close combat. In a one-on-one close combat, Arcis was not even afraid of Wang Tianzong without listen to the sea. It was no exaggeration to say that Arcis was now the strongest person in close combat in the entire dark world. In the entire dark world, there might be only one unique skill that could compete with Arcis in close combat without falling into a disadvantageous position. Dragon Fist. The Dragon Fist of the Lin clan and the Li family. Only the Dragon Fist. But the Dragon Fist was the unique skill of the invincible manual in the map of God of War. For hundreds of years, except for the ancestors of the Lin clan, none of the invincible realm experts of the Lin clan and the Li family had practiced the invincible manual. Although there was Li Tianlan now, Li Tianlan was far from growing up. Therefore, in this field, Arcis was still the strongest, second to none. At this moment, Paul's shadow slaughter was also extremely strange, and it was also a close combat. After being crowned by the Pope, Mellad was already in the invincible realm, and his real strength was close to the peak of the invincible realm. He was not much weaker than Paul. He could be said to be one of the people with the highest realm in the field, so he could naturally see how terrifying this shadow slaughter was. In terms of lethality and ferocity, Paul's shadow slaughter was far inferior to Arcis's. But this unique skill was too fast, extremely strange, and the angle was tricky. In close combat, this kind of unique skill could be said to be the best unique skill for the weak to defeat the strong. Therefore, Mellad could only choose to make a move. If he didn't make a move at this time, Paul's shadow slaughter had the possibility of defeating several invincible realm experts present one by one. Even Arceus might be seriously injured. In this state, Paul had not yet reached the peak of the invincible realm. But with this unique skill, his lethality had firmly reached that field. Mellad naturally didn't care about Arceus's life or death, but it was also His Majesty's plan to destroy Rothschild. How could he delay it? Therefore, in the chaos of Eastern Europe, on the battlefield of the Invincible Realm, facing Paul, who was at the peak of the Invincible Realm, the first to make a move and join hands were the sworn enemies of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican and the commander of the Dark Knights. The light of countless scenes expanded wildly. Mellad's sudden attack directly showed all the strength he could show at this time in his realm. Countless huge pillars of light suddenly exploded after expanding to the limit. The light scattered and fell like rain. The pure and broken light almost completely illuminated the night sky. Countless rays of light seemed to become a piece of pure water that kept fluctuating. Under the light, Paul's figure became clearer than ever. The huge black hammer in Raphael's hand fell to the ground, and the long street suddenly shook. The dense cracks on the street spread in all directions. The huge force shattered the shops on both sides of the road. Smoke and dust also fell to the ground with broken glass. There was a loud roar. Raphael was expressionless. He held the hammer in his hand tightly and suddenly waved it. The hammer cut through the air and made an extremely loud and dull sound. The dark saint's spear suddenly changed in the air. It turned into a huge black long saber. Raphael held the long saber in his hand and rushed directly to Paul. After a moment of hesitation, everyone made a move at the same time. There was no nonsense. Cass Rotter, Huan Kong, Qin Shilai, and Mitchell all rushed to Paul without hesitation. Since the beginning of the chaos in Eastern Europe tonight, this was the first time that many invincible realm experts had besieged one person at the same time. The battlefield that only belonged to the invincible realm had completely opened in the violent battle. Chapter 502. Shadows and light were entangled crazily in the night sky. In different directions, countless rays of light burst out completely. The dark saint's spear had become a huge broad-edged long saber. The blade was 3 meters long, but when Raphael waved it, the black saber light, which was hundreds of meters long, seemed to tear the world apart. Mellad had become completely serious. Bright and pure rays of light flew wildly around his body and gradually turned into a light curtain. The light curtain continued to spread in the shadows. Mellad's entire body tensed up in an instant. In the large expanse of pure light, he directly rushed towards Paul. Cass Rotter was also moving. Among all the people present, Cass Rotter was the strongest invincible realm expert other than Paul on the surface, so his speed was naturally the fastest. The moment the dark saber light of the dark saint's spear fell, Cass Rotter's figure had already appeared directly in front of Paul. He punched. Powerful thunderbolt. In an instant, a sea of thunder appeared in the air. The vast and majestic thunderbolts fell down densely and smashed the space. The night sky was constantly distorted by the raging thunderbolts. The blue thunderbolts were refracted into colorful light by the distorted space. Cass Rotter's eyes were focused and solemn. Without any probing, he went all out the moment he made up his mind to make a move. He was the god of war of Star State. To some extent, he could even be said to be the god of war of North America. Cass Rotter's own growth trajectory was legendary. Star State and North America also had martial arts forces with a long history. But Cass Rotter did not come from any martial arts force. He was the most traditional soldier in Star State. His parents died when he was a child. When he was 8 years old, he was taken to a secret military base in Star State to receive training. At the age of 12, he entered the special warfare system of Star State. Now, he was 52 years old and had fought for Star State for 40 years. From the most junior soldier to the brigadier general, and then to the general, until he became the god of war today, Cass Rotter's strength was completely forged in countless life and death battles. He did not have any martial arts philosophy, so naturally, he did not have any martial arts style. But in other words, he was already very familiar with any fighting style, and it could even be said to be his style. This was an expert of the invincible realm who didn't rely on any external force and completely relied on himself. Cass Rotter was able to reach the peak of the invincible realm today. Both his perseverance and talent were shocking. All the invincible realm experts in the world, including Wang Tianzong, Deity, and Arsis, who were at the peak of the invincible realm, were probably not as experienced as Cass Rotter in actual combat. Paul's realm was higher than Cass Rotter's, but in front of this kind of invincible realm expert who had killed his way out, realms sometimes didn't mean everything, especially when their realms were similar. Therefore, Paul did not hesitate to dodge Cass Rotter's attack. In mid-air, the two of them hurriedly exchanged punches. A surging sea of lightning erupted wildly. With the help of Cass Rotter's punch, Paul instantly retreated hundreds of meters. However, before he could stabilize his body, the Dark Saint Spear's blade slashed at him from behind again. Cass Rotter roared almost crazily as he rushed past the fading shadows and approached them. The bright sword light flashed in a white arc high up in the sky. Boundless sharpness gathered in one place. Qianxia was high in the sky. His body suddenly turned upside down, head down and feet up, and he stabbed down with his sword. The earth split. The man and the sword became one. The sharpness and Qianxia merged together, as if they were completely burning. In the deep night sky, the shadow of a long sword that was hundreds of meters long but extremely slender and dangerous suddenly appeared. With extreme penetrating power and killing intent, the shadow directly locked Paul in the night sky. The extremely solid ground below suddenly turned into a vast ocean. The torrent of power that was enough to destroy everything suddenly rose. Huan Kong and Mitchell made a move at the same time. Their power gathered together without hesitation and attacked Paul from a distance. Cass Rotter appeared near Paul once again. The thunderbolts that kept spreading around him stopped for a moment, and then disappeared completely. Or rather, they didn't disappear. Instead, all the thunderbolts restrained their light. The sharpness in the sky was above. The torrent of power was below. The invisible thunderbolts filled the surrounding world in an instant, turning it into an extremely solidified domain. A unique skill. In the world of thunder. An obvious and clear sense of numbness filled Paul's whole body. His extremely agile and strange figure instantly slowed down a lot. The torrent surged. The sharpness was unparalleled. The black saber light split the sky. The pure light and the thunderbolts entangled with each other. All the power in the air gathered in one place. The space kept twisting and exploding, illuminating the whole world with colorful colors. Ah! An extremely high-pitched and sharp scream suddenly sounded. The voice was so sharp and loud that some of the soldiers of Wulan State who were closest to King Tong directly covered their ears and fell down. King Tong kept screaming. She was shrill, furious, and full of killing intent. As she screamed, she slowly squatted down with her arms around her shoulders. Such an action made her look like an ordinary girl who had been wronged but was extremely helpless. But before anyone had time to pity her, a shadow that was several times thicker than before suddenly burst out. The shadow was the domain. The shadow was several times thicker than before, which meant that King Tong's domain was several times thicker than before. She broke through. On the battlefield of the invincible realm, surrounded by a group of enemies, under great pressure, King Tong, who was already close to breaking through, took a step closer at the most critical moment. And it was a big step. On the road far ahead, the peak of the invincible realm was already in sight. On the road far behind, the invincible realm, which had been stabilized, became a little blurred. The thick shadow continued to spread, one after another, like layers of ripples shaking endlessly. The pure light around Mellad was suppressed in the blink of an eye. The gray shadow spread in the distance and rushed into the dark world. Under the influence of King Tong's domain, Paul's actions suddenly became extremely agile. He rarely fought in his life, but it didn't mean that he didn't study martial arts in his daily life. As a super expert who had quietly approached the peak of the invincible realm, the shadow slaughter could be said to be the highest achievement in his life. But this unique skill was not perfect. At present, the biggest shortcoming was that when he used the shadow slaughter, his domain and this unique skill were not perfectly combined. In other words, the shadow slaughter was his strongest attack state, and when he was in his strongest state, his domain was the weakest. If he could perfectly combine his domain with the shadow slaughter, he would go further and become a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm. This step was very close for Paul, but it was also very far. At least it was impossible tonight. But tonight, he had King Tong by his side. And it was King Tong who had made a breakthrough. King Tong's domain could completely make up for the weakness in his domain. Now King Tong had made another breakthrough, and her domain had been strengthened. Coupled with Paul's existing domain, the two of them worked together, and Paul's last weakness had completely disappeared. What did this mean? The shadow slaughter was perfect. Now Paul's domain was also perfect. In King Tong's domain, Paul was no longer infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. He was at the peak of the invincible realm. Paul suddenly laughed. His laughter was very soft, but it was incomparably cold and arrogant. It carried with it an extremely clear sense of contempt. The peak of the invincible realm was the god of the dark world. There were not only ordinary experts in the dark world, but also some ordinary invincible realm experts who had not reached the peak of the invincible realm. Paul's laughter became more and more arrogant. King Tong's incomparably dense and solidified domain spread over layer by layer, and an obscure vortex appeared on the ground. Under the scouring of King Tong's domain, the torrent of power of Huan Kong and Mitchell also became much more illusory. A faintly discernible but incomparably cold sense of danger rose in the hearts of everyone around them. High in the sky, the sharp sword light became more and more dazzling. Paul raised his head and glanced at Qin Shilai, with undisguised killing intent in his eyes. Qin Shilai suddenly gritted his teeth. The sword light flowed, but the momentum suddenly changed. The remaining power of the earth-splitting move was still there, but the sword light had changed perfectly once, and its momentum was even stronger than before. Earth-destroying move. Paul stretched out his palm. The thick shadow and the dazzling sword light instantly intersected. A gray wave visible to the naked eye completely burst out at the intersection of Paul's palm and the blade of the sharp sword. Cass Rotter's body suddenly shook. The world of thunder that imprisoned Paul was on the verge of collapse. The dark saber light of the Dark Saint's spear was completely shattered. In the close distance of the entanglement of light and darkness, Paul firmly pinched the blade of the sharp sword with one hand. Qin Shilai gritted his teeth and tried his best to stab with the sword. It's useless. Paul's voice was soft and piercingly cold. Since you all want to die, then go to hell. Bang! The incomparably crisp sound of breaking suddenly resounded through the night sky. The sword energy, which had been condensed to the extreme, completely exploded and scattered in disorder. Paul's face was expressionless. With one hand, he directly broke the famous sword, the sharp edge, which was famous in the dark world. Qin Shilai's face instantly turned pale. The sword energy surged uncontrollably in all directions. The corner of his mouth moved, and he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. Mel Lad, whose expression changed dramatically, suddenly roared, "The Gate of Hope." The Gate of Hope was not his unique skill. But it was the unique skill of the Vatican. As his voice fell, the team of the Vatican Saint warriors suddenly lit up with a large amount of light. The light was like a waterfall, surging up wildly. At the same time, the attacks of the invincible realm experts came roaring again. Paul's figure suddenly flickered. The next second, everyone's attacks were completely defeated by his tough counterattack. His figure reappeared in everyone's line of sight, empty-handed. Qin Shilai, who had escaped, looked at the sharp edge in his hand that had been broken, and then at Paul's empty hands. His expression changed dramatically. Suddenly, a panic-stricken and heavy breathing sound rang out in the silent atmosphere. A few people turned their heads subconsciously. In their sight, Mitchell, who was the weakest but also a genuine invincible realm expert, stiffened on the spot. His eyes were fixed on Paul. A section of the blade had pierced into his abdomen, but there was no blood. Charlemagne will accompany you soon. Paul said calmly. Mitchell raised his hands with difficulty, but as soon as he said a word, his body suddenly swelled. Bang! There was another dull thud. The body of Mitchell, the second in command of the Heroes Club and an invincible realm expert, suddenly exploded and turned into flesh and blood flying all over the sky. Chapter 503. The whole battlefield fell completely silent in an instant. Among the saint warriors of the Vatican, the pure light that had just risen suddenly dissipated. In the brief silence, almost everyone's faces were blank. Even several invincible realm experts didn't know what had happened. They were invincible realm experts. They were the figures standing at the peak of the dark world. The chaos in Eastern Europe was surging, and the general trend was mighty. It was not that no one had thought that an invincible realm expert would die, but no one had thought that the invincible realm expert would die so easily. In a few minutes, light and darkness alternated, and then there was a rain of blood. The sacrifice of thousands of soldiers in Wulan state was not as impactful as the death of Mitchell. The rain of blood that suddenly exploded in the night was like a basin of seawater that had been fished out from under the glacier of the Arctic Ocean. It splashed on several invincible realm experts with an incomparably piercing coldness. Paul stood in the encirclement of several invincible realm experts, and his expression was still calm and gentle. But the move of shadow slaughter just now had cut off the sharpness and killed the invincible realm experts. It was only for a moment, but it had already shown the absolute strength of the Patriarch of Rothschild. Paul's eyes moved from Cass Rotter to Raphael, Qin Shilai, Huan Kong, and Mel Lad. He suddenly chuckled and said, "Who else wants to die?" His voice was gentle and calm, but there was undisguised arrogance in his words. A strong sense of humiliation rushed directly to the heads of several invincible realm experts. Cass Rotter took a step forward. His footsteps were getting faster and faster. He took big steps, and then he began to charge with all his might. A large amount of blue light flowed out of his body. At this moment, even Cass Rotter's eyes turned blue. The martial arts of this star-state god of war had no trace of martial arts power. He entered the thunder-shocking realm at the age of 27 and reached the peak of the thunder-shocking realm at the age of 29. But when he broke through from the thunder-shocking realm to the invincible realm, he was already close to 50 years old. Nearly 20 years of life in the thunder-shocking realm had made him accustomed to it. Even if he broke through to the invincible realm, his attacks were still filled with thousands of thunderbolts. Even his invincible domain was thunderbolts. Endless thunderbolts bloomed and spread on Cass Rotter's body, then contracted and condensed. The thunderbolts kept changing, and finally condensed into a light shadow similar to armor. The silhouette of Cass Rotter's armor surrounded him from head to toe, making him appear incomparably majestic. This set of armor was Cass Rotter's domain, and also his most powerful technique. Thunder God Possession. Gate of Hope. Melad's roar sounded again. Hundreds of saint warriors glowed with pure light at the same time. King Tong was still squatting on the ground. However, her body became more and more tense, and the domain that was slowly spreading out with her as the core suddenly became more turbulent. The speed of the gray ripples began to increase, and the color had almost turned black. Most of the pure light formed by hundreds of saint warriors was washed away by the domain of King Tong, but a small amount of light barely broke through the shadow and fell on several invincible realm experts. The light flowed on the bodies of the invincible realm experts, and the night sky within a few meters suddenly turned into day. Mellad suddenly frowned. This result was far too different from what he had expected. The Gate of Hope could be said to be one of the strongest unique skills in the Vatican's defense system. It could even be said to be the unique skill that best restrained the Dark Shadow royal family. If King Tong hadn't made a breakthrough, hundreds of saint warriors would have launched the Gate of Hope at the same time, which would have completely dispelled King Tong's domain. At that time, the light on the bodies of the invincible realm experts would have been completely connected. Within a kilometer, no matter how strong Paul was, he wouldn't have been able to hide his figure. However, King Tong's breakthrough had condensed her domain several times. Now, when the light of the Gate of Hope came, it was difficult for it to spread to a distance of 10 meters from several invincible realm experts, not to mention a piece of it. 10 meters was not a distance at all. Paul would show up within 10 meters, but at most, he could only give a few invincible realm experts some time to react. Kill Kong Tong. The huge black saber in Raphael's hand slashed at King Tong. The sharp black knife light appeared in front of King Tong almost in an instant. This slash was like a signal. The Dark Knights, Fantasy World, the Vatican, the Men in Black, and even the Heroes Club and all the soldiers around Wulan State rushed to King Tong. Paul is very strong. But in the current situation, only King Tong is the key. The solidification of King Tong's domain after the breakthrough perfectly made up for Paul's shortcomings. But where King Tong's domain spread, Paul's strength was almost no weaker than that of any expert at the peak of the invincible realm. He was invincible at the peak of the invincible realm. So he could only kill King Tong first. King Tong was motionless. At this moment, she completely gave up all the unique skills and means of attack. All her strength and will were unprecedentedly focused. The gray domain, which was close to darkness, shook and spread out layer by layer. For a moment, the light on the bodies of several invincible realm experts had been suppressed to the lowest point. The whole situation suddenly became extremely chaotic. For both sides, time was everything. After the breakthrough, King Tong was very strong. However, there was more than one expert of the half-step invincible realm in the teams of the Dark Knights, the Vatican, the Fantasy World, and the Men in Black. Several experts of the half-step invincible realm, dozens of experts at the peak of the Thundershocking realm, and more experts of the Thundershocking realm besieged King Tong's domain at the same time. King Tong could not hold on for too long. But the problem was that if King Tong's domain was not broken, the several invincible realm experts could not hold on for too long. In this state, there was no way out for both sides. They could only hold on. King Tong placed her hopes on Paul. Several invincible realm experts, on the other hand, placed their hopes on the people who besieged King Tong. Kill, kill, kill. Raphael's eyes suddenly turned scarlet. The blade of the dark saint spear shrank, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into an extremely slender and sharp black long saber that was less than 2 meters long. Raphael's momentum suddenly changed, and he went completely mad. He rushed through the night with the light on his body, like a meteor in the night sky, and appeared beside Paul in an instant. Darkness went berserk. The almost crazy killing intent was mighty in the blade of the dark saint spear. The night sky was torn apart by the saber light, and countless shadows were chopped into pieces by Raphael's saber. Cass Rotter, who was possessed by the thunder god, also attacked with all his strength. Crazy thunder. Crazy saber. Qin Shilai clenched the broken sword in his hand and rushed up again without hesitation. An extremely ferocious scarlet dagger appeared in Paul's hand. The dagger was extremely long, and it could even be said to be a short saber. Countless thunderbolts and saber lights surged around him. Paul held the dagger, and the moment the shadows around him surged, he took a step back and disappeared in an instant. Be careful. Cass Rotter and Raphael warned at the same time. Clang. The crisp sound of weapons clashing suddenly rang out. Before Cass Rotter and Raphael's voices had died away, Paul's body had already appeared directly in front of Huan Kong, the lord of the fantasy world. The scarlet dagger, like a red bolt of lightning, fell in an instant and smashed hard on the dagger in Huan Kong's hand. Sparks flew everywhere. The dagger in Huan Kong's hand broke into 2 pieces without any suspense. Under the tremendous force, Huan Kong, who was bleeding from the corner of his mouth, was directly smashed to the ground. The instant the two of them fought, the shattered space kept spreading as he fell. Some of the elites who were besieging King Tong were directly swallowed up. Huan Kong fell to the ground and vomited a lot of blood. He couldn't stand up for a while. Paul's face was slightly pale, but he didn't slow down his movements at all. The moment King Tong's domain spread out again, his figure flashed for a moment and directly appeared in front of Mellad. It was not until this time that Raphael's somewhat gloomy voice suddenly sounded. Ghost hand. Ghost Hand, the legendary European saber. The sharpest weapon of Rothschild. Among the 12 murderous weapons, the indefinite grace was almost as famous as the human emperor. And the famous saber, Ghost Hand, could also be as famous as the listen to the sea sword of the Wang family of Beihai. Its sharpness was unparalleled. Mellad retreated backward completely out of conditioned reflex. But in the next moment, Paul directly appeared behind Mellad, and his arms wrapped around Mellad's neck. Ghost Hand cuts throat. In the domain of King Tong, Paul could almost be said to be the most flexible invincible realm expert in the dark world today. His defense and attack were very ordinary, but his body movement, which could be studied based on the domain, was extremely strange and unfathomable. Under such circumstances, Mellad's expression changed drastically. He blocked Paul's palm and suddenly exerted his strength. The void surged layer by layer, and the domains on their bodies collided fiercely. Mellad let out a muffled groan and forcibly broke free from Paul's dagger. Paul's attack missed, so he condensed his body again and appeared not far away. There was a bloody hole in Mellad's neck. Although the wound was not deep, the blood flowing out was shocking. Mellad slowly touched his wound and looked at Paul. An incomparably violent murderous aura suddenly flashed across his eyes. Paul was also staring at Mellad. His eyes were extremely deep. His mistake just now was normal, but it was also abnormal. His strength was just right. If Mellad was really at the level of an ordinary invincible realm expert, it was basically impossible for him to resist his all-out surprise attack. But in fact, Mellad had really resisted it. The exchange of blows just now was too fast, and it gave Paul a very vague feeling. But in that short period of time, he clearly sensed the danger that Mellad was in. Moreover, the unique skill that Mellad had used to break free from his dagger just now was not a technique of the Vatican. Did this vice-commander of the Vatican's Holy Disarmament Corps hide his strength, or did he have another identity? There was a flash of playfulness in Paul's eyes. He looked around at the several invincible realm experts around him, as if he was looking for a target and waiting for an opportunity to make a move. Every invincible realm expert was tense, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Paul was definitely the most troublesome opponent. His attack was not strong, and his defense was not strong, but he was extremely flexible. In terms of attack, he was even slightly inferior to Cassrotter. But no matter how strong Cassrotter was, what was the use of all his attacks if they couldn't hit Paul? Paul spoke slowly. However, as soon as his voice sounded, a louder voice had already come from below. An incomparably huge saber shadow swept across the block that was hundreds of meters long below in an instant. The crazy saber light shattered everything. The streets and buildings were shattered under the saber light. The first to bear the brunt were the elites who had besieged King Tong. The saber light flashed away, but the blood all over the sky flew wildly. Under this saber strike, countless elites of the Vatican, the Dark Knights, the fantasy world, and the men in black had fallen in the camps of all the forces. Paul suddenly burst out laughing. Cassrotter and Raphael's eyes turned red in an instant. Chapter 504. There was no sign of the huge change. It was completely sudden, but when the saber light lit up, it was incomparably tyrannical. Layers of saber light soared into the sky, sweeping through the crowd without the slightest leeway. It was hair-raising, and blood splattered everywhere. At the most critical and subtle time, the appearance of this saber almost completely changed the situation in the field. And this saber was not the end, but just the beginning. The confusion after a large number of lives withered still remained in everyone's heart. An extremely shrill howl sounded again. Before the blood and corpses in the air fell to the ground, the seemingly endless saber light on the ground bloomed crazily again. An extremely high-pitched, sharp, and extremely crazy scream resounded through the night sky along with the saber light. In the camp of the men in black, a high-level expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm was about to signal his people to gather, but the absolutely presumptuous saber light had already rushed in front of him. The saber light smashed the thunder and pierced the internal organs of the man. With a loud bang, the high-level expert of the Men in Black, who was famous in the dark world of North America, had been smashed into minced meat. The crazy saber light cut directly into the camp of the Men in Black and whistled. Wherever the saber light passed, the high-level experts and elites of the major forces were all chopped into pieces, and their blood shot high into the sky. But they did not fall under the saber light all over the sky. Instead, they were swept into the sky along with the saber light. Looking down from above, the crazy saber light raised a scarlet storm with a lot of minced meat and internal organs, cruel and tyrannical. There were many casualties. The pressure on King Tong's body suddenly lightened, and her expression completely relaxed. Countless shadows completely enveloped the entire battlefield nearby. The shadows suppressed all the elites of the major forces and merged with the saber light. The saber light rushed and killed in the crowd, and flesh and blood flew everywhere. It seemed to be more and more like a fish in water. King Tong raised her head and looked at the several invincible realm experts in the air. The corners of her mouth rose slightly, but there was undisguised killing intent and anger in her eyes. Ah! The scream that almost pierced people's eardrums rang out again. The bloody storm that was spinning crazily in the shadows suddenly came to a halt. In the next second, the cruel and cold saber light instantly expanded to hundreds of meters, and the huge saber phantom that was hundreds of meters long rotated for a moment in an extremely light manner. A violent roar suddenly rang out. The area within a radius of several hundred meters completely exploded. The ground, the buildings, the shops, the street lamps, the cars on both sides of the road, everything was chopped into powder by this slash. In the camp of the major forces, the extremely bright lightning built one defensive wall after another. But when the saber light swept over, the defensive wall condensed by lightning was directly smashed without any suspense. Bright electric arcs danced everywhere. The saber light and the lightning spread to the army of Wulan State at the same time. A large number of soldiers were smashed by the saber light and the lightning at the same time, and died without a whole corpse. Blood flowed like a river. Everything happened in an instant. The saber light crisscrossed, and it was a real disaster. Violet. Raphael's furious voice covered the night sky, like the roar of a god. You're courting death. Mayor Morden's Violet. He was an invincible realm expert of the Violet family, one of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe. She was not the clan leader. She was the wife of the patriarch of the Violet family. Raphael subconsciously glanced at Qin Shilai. Out of trust in Li Tianlan, he did not ask about Li Tianlan's entire plan. But he still knew that the Qin clan in Eastern Europe would join hands with Rekvia to stop the Violet and Morton families. But now, Violet had appeared here. Where were the people of the Qin clan and the Rekvia family? In Raphael's sight, Qin Shilai's expression was still as calm as before. The Qin clan and the Rekvia family were indeed going to stop Violet and Morton. But not now. The bloody storm on the ground finally began to dissipate slowly. But wherever the saber light passed just now, it rolled up the blood and internal organs of countless elites and rushed up to a height of hundreds of meters. Now as the storm dissipated, the blood and rain all over the sky fell at the same time. The scene looked strange and evil. A somewhat short woman appeared in front of King Tong. She was only 1.6 meters tall at most. Among Europeans, she was indeed a mini pocket-sized, but her figure was extremely hot. Her silver hair was scattered on her shoulders. This invincible realm woman, whose strength was not as good as Qin Shilai's, was far more famous in Eastern Europe. She was smiling casually, and her smile was seductive and presumptuous. The blood rain kept falling. Violet casually sucked the blood on her hand that belonged to someone. In Raphael's loud roar, she chuckled softly. How dare you come to Eastern Europe? You're all going to die tonight, all of you. There was silence in the sky. Even Raphael fell silent. Women had never been weak in the dark world. On the divine list, the master of Samsara Palace, Situ Tsanyue. King Tong was shining brightly. On the holy list, there were also experts like Violet. Violet's ranking on the holy list was second only to Huan Kong, the dominator of fantasy world. She might not be a match for any invincible realm expert present, but her arrival was enough to break the extremely fragile balance in the field. The battle before Violet's arrival was fierce and deadlocked. If the elites of the major forces could break through King Tong's defense line and prevent her domain from supporting Paul would definitely die. If Paul could kill one or two invincible realm experts in King Tong's domain, he and King Tong could also break through successfully. Now that Violet was here, it not only meant that under her protection, King Tong's domain was unbreakable, but it also meant that the elites of the major forces on the ground were also in danger under Violet's butcher knife. If King Tong's domain was not broken, Paul would be at the peak of the invincible realm. It was only a matter of time before he defeated them. Unless they could have at least one more invincible realm expert who could restrain Violet. Cass Rotter suddenly glanced at Qin Shilai. Mellad was also looking at Qin Shilai. Cass Rotter quickly looked away. However, Mellad remained calm and collected. At the very least, he knew that there could be at least one more invincible realm expert on Li Tianlan's side. No matter whether that invincible realm expert was the master of Samsara Palace or not, he definitely belonged to Samsara Palace. Qin Shilai, Raphael, and that invincible realm expert were the normal lineup on Li Tianlan's side. Dear, Mellad narrowed his eyes. Just as he was about to speak, the night sky in the distance suddenly twisted. An incomparably huge domain was roaring and surging in the night sky. The domain continued to expand and became more and more obvious. In the end, it turned into a huge vortex that seemed to devour the whole sky. A blazing white light suddenly lit up in the center of the vortex. The light was like lightning. In an instant, it traversed the night sky. Almost in the blink of an eye, it had arrived behind Cass Rotter. Caught off guard, Cass Rotter instinctively crossed his hands, and lightning burst out in front of him. But the blazing white light tore the night sky with a strong impact. In an instant, it pushed Cass Rotter nearly 100 meters away. The distance of 100 meters was not long, but there was an irreparable gap in the formation of several invincible realm experts besieging Paul. The light of hell. It's hostile. Be careful. Mellad's hoarse voice suddenly rang out. Everyone hoped that there could be another invincible realm expert in the field. So the invincible realm expert really came. And he was the top expert in Eastern Europe after Tyrant disappeared. But damn it, he was an invincible realm expert who was standing opposite several invincible realm experts. He was Patriarch Hostile, who was ranked 14th on the divine list and one of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church. The light of heaven was Hostile's signature unique skill. But in the eyes of the Vatican, the people of the Eastern Church were all heretics. The light of heaven naturally became the light of hell. The opportunity appeared in an instant. But for Paul, it was a long-awaited opportunity. The moment Cass Rotter was pushed away by the light of heaven, Paul's whole body suddenly tightened. He shouted, "King Tong!" Puff! When Violet appeared, King Tong, who had been prepared, tensed her body to the limit. As soon as Paul opened his mouth, the Queen of the Shadow Throne suddenly opened her hands. A mouthful of blood flowed directly from the corner of her mouth as she burst out with all her strength. King Tong's hands became tighter and tighter. The thick shadow surged like a tide, becoming unprecedentedly crazy. The shadow was like a tide. Paul took a step into the shadow. Shadow slaughter. Without any reservation, at this moment, he was truly at the peak of the invincible realm in King Tong's domain. He had the strongest speed and the fastest attack. His figure flickered and disappeared in an instant. The shadow of death suddenly enveloped every invincible realm expert. No one could see Paul's figure. But the next moment, an extremely dull sound suddenly rang out in the sky. Bang! It was like a broken balloon. The dull sound was very low, but it was so shocking. A ball of blood-colored light directly exploded in the air. The powerful domain expanded and shrank with the death of its master. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Cass Rotter, who had rushed back to the battlefield at full speed against the light of heaven, suddenly became extremely cold. Qin Shilai, Mellad, and Raphael all looked stupefied. That piece of flesh and blood had been completely blown apart. But everyone knew who the person in that position should be. Fantasy world in North America. Huan Kong, an invincible realm expert. He had just been smashed to the ground by Paul. Now that he had just rushed back to the battlefield, Paul, who had burst out without reservation, had already appeared in front of him. He was killed with one blow. Tonight, the second invincible realm expert died. Before anyone had time to sigh with emotion about the fate of fantasy world in the future, Paul's figure had disappeared again. An extremely scarlet light suddenly appeared in the eyes of the dark sword master of Eastern Europe. The night sky was so vast. The shadow was infinite. The red light suddenly expanded in the blink of an eye. The red light was strange. Paul's incomparably cold eyes appeared in front of his eyes. Ghost Hand, the famous saber. The scarlet blade of the ghost hand was raised, and the extreme power brought the blade down suddenly. At this moment, the sharpness of the ghost hand had surpassed Qin Shilai's thinking. Qin Shilai subconsciously raised the blade, but the speed at which he raised the sword suddenly became extremely slow. The blade of the ghost hand moved from top to bottom, as if it was going to cut his body into pieces. Qin Shilai blinked. The blade fell in an instant. An incomparably huge force suddenly came from behind. On the edge of the fall, a palm suddenly grabbed Qin Shilai's body and pulled him back dozens of meters. The blade chopped down fiercely, but it was only a shadow that was broken. Paul was stunned and looked up silently. In his sight, an extremely thin figure appeared behind Qin Shilai. He was dressed in black. A silver mask. It was cold and awe-inspiring. Chapter 505. Paul frowned and suddenly felt a little uneasy. The person who could suddenly make a move on the battlefield of the invincible realm and save Qin Shilai at the critical moment was undoubtedly in the invincible realm. But in Paul's perception, the other party's state was extremely strange, or in other words, his realm was very chaotic. His realm seemed to have just entered the invincible realm and could not be stabilized. But even Paul was amazed by the speed that broke out in an instant. His own defense and attack were not excellent. In the shadow domain, his strongest point was the strange attack that was impossible to guard against. To put it bluntly, this kind of martial arts style was actually a real assassin. Paul was the patriarch of Rothschild, not an assassin. But his style had already been determined. The upper and lower limits of the top assassins were infinite. Similarly, the top assassins often did not pay much attention to the strength on paper in the battle. Most of the examples of the weak defeating the strong in the dark world were created by the assassins. To some extent, the assassins who were flexible and strange and could kill with one blow were the easiest people to create miracles. Paul could be said to be at the peak in this field. So he was not afraid of Arsis, whose strength was stronger than his on paper. In the domain of King Tong, he was even more confident. But the most troublesome thing for him was to face the top assassins in the dark world. Who was the strongest assassin in the dark world? This question might have been controversial more than 3 years ago, but with the death of Wuxia Xianxia of the Jianghu family of South America in the final battle of Heaven Capital, all the controversies no longer existed. In this era, there was only one strongest assassin, and he was also the only assassin of the invincible realm in the dark world. Sai City, Zhongzhou State. Tribulation. Paul stared at the silver mask in front of him. All his emotions were restrained, and he became serious and serious. Lord of Shadow? Paul asked softly, with an indescribable emotion in his tone. Thank you, Your Highness. Qin Shilai, who was shocked and stable, took a deep breath, but his face was still a little pale. The moment just now was very short, but it was the closest he had ever been to death in his life. The feeling of brushing past death could be said to be unforgettable, so his thanks were also very sincere. I owe you a life. Tribulation shook his head slowly and suddenly glanced at Mellad. Mellad was stunned, and then he understood what tribulation meant. Without the slightest hesitation, he directly stretched out his hand, and an extremely pure light suddenly bloomed in his hand. The light was like a tide, surging and converging, and finally fell on Tribulation. The Gate of Hope. This was the Gate of Hope that Mellad had personally opened. This light was so pure and dazzling. Even though it had been worn out by the shadows of King Tong and Paul, it was still like the brightest star in the night sky. Paul's eyes were cold. Mellad could understand what Tribulation meant, so could he. In the shadows, almost no one was able to capture his movements with his battle prowess just now. But now there was Tribulation. Tribulation's body was glowing. As long as Tribulation could keep up with Paul's speed, under the light, Paul's advantage would be mostly wasted. The dazzling light wrapped around Tribulation. Under the silver mask, Tribulation's eyes were cold and indifferent. Paul's figure began to slowly retreat. Tribulation seemed to move. The dazzling light seemed to still be there. But the shadow around Paul was instantly dispersed. Before Paul could even realize what was happening, an extremely cold wind suddenly blew in front of him. Paul's heart sank, and he quickly retreated. But the next second, a silver mask appeared in front of him. How could it be so fast? The thought turned in his mind for a moment. He clenched Ghost Hand and slashed at it directly. 3 black shadows wrapped in light appeared around Paul at the same time. The scarlet saber light of Ghost Hand split Tribulation's body, but what it hit was only a shadow. Shadow formula. Switching positions. Tribulation, who had changed positions with the shadow, was getting closer to Paul. The 3 shadows and Tribulation himself had made the light continuous. A lot of light shone on Paul, and Paul's figure became clearer than ever. Forbid. A low voice sounded in the night sky. The light, the shadow, and the night sky twisted wildly at the same time. Paul's figure froze for a moment. The next second, Tribulation's hands had begun to make a seal. Slaughter. The 3 dark shadows copied Tribulation's movements at the same time. Crazy power surged from all directions, with Tribulation as the center. The nearby twisted space seemed to be completely pulled by Tribulation's handprint. The absolute power was violent and chaotic, roaring as it was pulled by Tribulation and smashed toward Paul. The constantly shaking space was completely out of control. Paul's face changed dramatically in an instant. "You lunatic." Before he finished speaking, a large piece of space, which was constantly twisting and exploding, had directly shrouded him. It enveloped Paul. At the same time, it also enveloped Tribulation. Tribulation's eyes grew colder and colder. He was the strongest assassin in the dark world, so he knew very well how much damage a person like Paul could cause in a stalemate. After tonight, Li Tianlan and Rothschild were mortal enemies. Under such circumstances, Tribulation didn't want to let go of any accident, nor would he give him the slightest chance to break out of the encirclement. The whole situation had begun to collapse gradually. The addition of the 2 invincible realm experts, Violet and Hustile, had given Paul the power to fight back. Together with King Tong, Paul already had 4 invincible realm experts on his side. Arcis of the Vatican hadn't arrived yet. The situation was dragging on. It was not even a question of whether Rothschild would break out of the encirclement, but whether Paul would reverse the whole situation and turn defeat into victory. An assassin-type expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm could create any miracle in such a scene. Therefore, Tribulation's actions were extremely intense. He didn't hold back at all. As soon as he got close to Paul, he had already twisted the space within hundreds of meters around him. In the Buddhist incantation of 9 words, the shadow formula was the fastest, the stop formula was similar to the domain, and the slaughter formula was a strong attack. The space within hundreds of meters was constantly twisting and exploding. Tribulation's hands were still making gestures. Destroy. Boom. The whole night sky completely exploded. Countless streams of light flew wildly, looking extremely gorgeous. Tribulation's invincible realm was not stable. The breakthrough back then was too intense. Until today, his injuries had not recovered. Therefore, he was no match for Paul, and he didn't expect to be able to kill Paul. But his heart was far colder than Paul's. This was the real assassin's heart. Paul's fighting style was that of an assassin, but he didn't have the mentality of an assassin, so he was just the patriarch of Rothschild. Tribulation, on the other hand, was a real assassin. He went all out to twist the void within hundreds of meters around him. Under the confinement of the stop formula, the space that was completely out of control kept exploding, covering Paul and himself. In this completely out of control range, the huge power could destroy everything, hurt Paul, and also hurt Tribulation himself. This was completely a way of dying together. Determined, ruthless, and relentless. Kill. Cass Rotter suddenly opened his hands. A thunderbolt, which was already so dense that it was almost tangible, was constantly condensing in his hands. Cass Rotter's eyes were fierce and crazy. A large area of the void began to flash with thunderbolts. All the thunderbolts were condensed in his hands. A thunderball emitting a faint blue light had condensed between Cass Rotter's hands. At this moment, no one hesitated. Everyone understood what tribulation meant. The Lord of Shadow and the Dark World completely locked on Paul regardless of his own safety. The void kept exploding around the two of them. As strong as Paul was, it was impossible for him to completely get rid of this completely out-of-control domain in a short time. For all the Invincible Realm experts, this was the best opportunity. The thunderbolts in Cass Rotter's hands shone with an incomparably dazzling light. His open hands suddenly began to close, and he placed them on the thunderbolt ball. A huge force surged between his arms, squeezing the lightning orb. Boom! In the deep night sky, there was a sudden sound of thunder that was enough to shock the whole city. The ball that had condensed infinite thunderbolts completely exploded. Thousands of thunderbolts covered the sky and kept falling toward the domain where Tribulation and Paul were. Thunder God strike. This strike completely ignored the enemy and himself. It enveloped Paul and Tribulation at the same time. The black saber light converged with the awe-inspiring sword intent in the thunderbolts all over the sky. Raphael and Qin Shilai were already standing together. The saber light and the sword energy roared wildly. In the out-of-control domain, thunderbolts fell down, and the cold saber light and sword energy flew around like rain. Tribulation seemed to have lost his mind. Countless saber light and sword energy pierced through his body. In the dripping blood, he chased after Paul like crazy. Every time Paul flashed, he was completely locked on by him. The two figures were constantly entangled in the killing intent all over the sky. More and more blood was on Tribulation's body, but his eyes were getting colder and colder. Brother. King Tong, who was on the ground, desperately condensed her domain, and a large number of shadows flew like a tide. The night sky in the distance was shaking at the same time. The blazing white light of heaven gathered crazily, but a strange domain imprisoned the light of heaven. In that domain, heaven and earth seemed to have lost gravity. Countless rays of light floated blankly in the domain, constantly gathering, and more. Heaven and earth were useless. Situ Tsangyue, the city governor of Sai City, stood in front of Patriarch Hostile and kept him there. Before the war broke out, she had texted Li Tianlan that she was in Reki City. It wasn't until now that she finally appeared. Everyone was fighting with all their might. The saber light, thunderbolts, and sword energy kept circling around. Paul couldn't get rid of Tribulation's desperate entanglement. Tribulation's injury was getting worse. But Paul's body was also stained with blood. His realm was not as good as Paul's. But he dared to die. To die. This was something that most Invincible Realm experts were unwilling to accept. But Tribulation did it in such an ordinary and resolute way. Violet on the ground finally stopped slaughtering the elites of the major forces. He rushed to the sky with the saber. Mellad finally got the chance. His voice shook the sky and said, "Purification." The pure light on his body soared in an instant. In an instant, light also appeared in the team of the Vatican on the ground. The light gathered on the ground and in the sky. Mellad's figure became extremely majestic in an instant. Buzz. The whole world suddenly buzzed for a moment. A force like a mountain and a sea rose from the ground and whizzed forward with an incomparably fierce momentum. Invincible strike. Another invincible realm expert rushed in at the most critical moment. The huge power gathered into a huge shadow of a fist. The shadow rushed up. This was not a reinforcement. It was Morton. Mellad flew into a rage. But the shadow of the fist swept across the sky. In an instant, it directly hit Raphael and Xianxia. The light on Mellad's body suddenly turned, and he was about to block the punch. But a ray of light suddenly appeared in his sight. It was a red light. It was like light, extremely weak. On the ground, a few lonely figures appeared in the chaotic crowd. Their eyes were a little blank and cold. However, a faint red light shot out from their eyes, bringing with it an unparalleled danger. Mellad suddenly thought of what His Majesty had told him before. A person whose eyes could glow red. His movements suddenly stiffened for a moment. In the blink of an eye, the punch that went up against the sky appeared directly behind Xianxia without Mellad's obstruction. Bang! The loud sound was extremely dull. Xianxia's body shook violently, and a large amount of blood mist burst out from all over his body. Chapter 506. This sudden punch could be said to have completely overturned the current situation. At the most anxious time, both Raphael and Xianxia had no time to care about other things. The full blow of an invincible realm expert went up against the sky. Mellad, who could have stopped it, hesitated for a moment. So in the blink of an eye, the huge fist shadow condensed with infinite power had already reached the back of Xianxia and Raphael. The edge was broken by Paul. Xianxia, whose sword energy was already a little weak, directly made the coldest and most rational choice. Even in his heyday, his strength was not as good as Raphael's, let alone in his current weak state. So in the face of this punch, he directly stood behind Raphael and used his body to face the fist shadow. This was not only for Raphael or Li Tianlan. Most importantly, it was for tonight. Li Tianlan and the Snowdance Corps were not the only ones who had a grudge against Rothschild tonight. Xianxia was the first invincible realm expert to make a move in this mess. If tonight's plan failed, when Rothschild recovered, Li Tianlan would not be able to bear the revenge of Paul and King Tong, and neither would the Qin clan in Eastern Europe. So tonight, they had to win. If they won, they would survive. If they lost, they would die. The punch, which was surging with endless power, completely fell on Xianxia's body, and the huge destructive power completely enveloped Xianxia. His body seemed to be blank. Xianxia was a little confused. In an instant, it seemed that all the warmth in his body rushed out with that blank space. There was a transparent bloody hole in his abdomen. Blood flowed out of the bloody hole and burst out from every part of his body. His body was completely out of control and he fell from the sky. No one knew whether Xianxia was alive or dead. But with such a serious injury, even if Xianxia was lucky to survive, it meant that the Dark Swordmaster was destined to withdraw from the battlefield tonight, and even from the Dark World forever. Some people quit, and some joined. As Xianxia's figure fell from the sky, another figure directly approached the air where Xianxia had been. The domain formed entirely by power was undulating and whistling around him. He clenched his hand and, without hesitation, punched Raphael again. In the surging domain of power, his figure was extremely strong and burly. Vaguely, people could see a dignified and serious face. Lagos Morton. He was the current patriarch of the Morton family, one of the 4 great families in Eastern Europe. He was an expert second only to Xianxia on the Holy List. Li Tianlan used the Snowdance Corps to imprison Rothschild's strongest ally, Wang Tianzong. But in the war of breaking out and fighting, Rothschild's trump cards in Eastern Europe were revealed one after another. Violet joined the fray. Patriarch Lawrence joined the battle. Lagos Morton joined the fray. Rothschild now had 5 invincible realm experts. As enemies, Mitchell died, Huan Kong died, and Xianxia withdrew from the battle. The two invincible realm experts of Rothschild completely turned the situation around in a desperate situation, and the real allies came. Get lost. Raphael, who had been saved by Qin Shilai, completely reacted. In the domain that had gone out of control ahead, the seriously injured Tribulation and Paul were still fighting crazily. The jet-black saber light fell into the domain. The fist shadows behind him roared and surged forward with boundless power. Raphael's eyes were bloodshot. He held the Dark Saint spear tightly and slashed at Lagos with a backhand slash. The ultimate technique of the Knights of Darkness instantly shattered the sky. Raphael was no longer in his peak state. But the suppression of an expert on the divine list over an expert on the holy list was still the most thorough. God Killer. The jet-black saber light was cold and treacherous. The saber light condensed and went crazy. In an instant, it appeared in front of Lagos's domain. One strike. With just one strike, the domain of power around Lagos collapsed. The fallen. Raphael's whole body had been completely surrounded by the thick darkness. The night was constantly twisting, surrounding everything around him and Lagos. The distorted night sky turned into giant blades with shocking murderous aura. The dark saber shadows smashed down overwhelmingly. Lagos's face suddenly changed. His body curled up for a moment, and then he stretched out with all his might, turned around, and ran away. Dark wanted. All the darkness around Raphael completely turned into a domain. The domain had a radius of hundreds of meters, but it kept shrinking and became extremely sticky in an instant. Lagos's figure became slower and slower in the domain of the dark wanted, and the saber shadows carried by the fallen had already smashed down like a rainstorm. How dare you! A crazed scream suddenly rang out. The crazy saber light lit up around the domain of the dark wanted in an instant. The saber light was violent and ferocious. Violet's figure appeared around the domain. The saber light burst out in an instant as she waved her saber. Lagos didn't hesitate to unleash his domain. Inside and outside the domain of the death wanted, the two experts on the holy list attacked with all their might at the same time. Raphael's domain almost exploded in an instant. Raphael's expression was still cold. His figure flashed forward and appeared directly between Violet and Lagos. The Dark Saint's spear was pointed at the sky. Raphael's face was pale and cold. The ultimate move. Dark Gospel. Boom. A large amount of black saber light filled with the aura of death burst out from the Dark Saint's spear and directly enveloped Lagos and Violet. The crazy battle reached its climax in the blink of an eye. Tribulation was still entangled with Paul. All the attacks of Cass Rotter and Mellad were merging with the domain that was out of control. The Dark Gospel brought with it a thick black fog of death. The fog kept condensing. Lagos and Violet were entangled with Raphael. In the distant sky, the domain of the useless heaven and earth imprisoned a large amount of the light of heaven. The whole night sky was constantly distorted under the white light. Situt Sanyue was still entangled with Patriarch Hostile. The shadow domain that filled the night sky began to shrink slowly. On the ground, King Tong's golden pupils suddenly became extremely cold. The shadow domain shrank for a moment. Paul's momentum dropped in an instant. The pressure on Tribulation lightened. But because of the absence of Raphael, even if Paul lost the domain of King Tong, the several invincible realm experts around him still couldn't pose a fatal threat to him. The shadow faded in just a few seconds. But a huge and cold sense of danger rose directly from the ground. The next second, the shadow spread again. King Tong's figure directly approached the sky. Without any hesitation, the shadow shrouded Paul's figure, and King Tong rushed directly to Mellad. The shadow and the light collided and fought. Blood splattered everywhere. An earth-shattering bang rang out, and the next second, it was continuous. Outside the out-of-control domain, there was no Raphael, no Mellad, and Tribulation who had been seriously injured. With only Cass Rotter left, Paul did not hesitate to attack with all his might. He directly smashed the domain that was completely out of control with one saber strike. Almost at the same time, the useless heaven and earth could no longer imprison more and more light of heaven. The light and the domain completely exploded after reaching the limit. Lagos and Violet also suffered serious injuries and forcibly broke through Raphael's domain. On the 3 battlefields, 3 explosions rang out almost at the same time. The incomparably great power rushed to the surface of the earth like the end of the world. Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, Lawrence. Raphael, Situtsanue, Cass Rotter, Tribulation, and Mellad. The battlefield of the 10 invincible realm experts ushered in the strongest collision. The strongest outburst of the 10 invincible realm experts rushed to the ground at the same time, like a hurricane that suddenly rose in the void. The violent and incredible power almost tore the earth apart in an instant. The hard ground, the tall buildings, and everything in the block completely collapsed under the violent power. The entire Reki city seemed to shake violently, and the wide block had been razed to the ground in an instant. Tribulation was covered in blood. His figure stood in the air, as if he wanted to do something. But the next moment, his figure shook violently and fell directly from the sky. Paul, who was also covered in blood, looked a little pale. He reached out his hand and slowly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Cass Rotter and then at the others. The current patriarch of Rothschild, who was so powerful that he almost subverted everyone's cognition, finally laughed. "You lost." His tone was calm and confident. Although Paul was injured, his combat capability was still there. He had survived all the way from the desperate situation to the present. There were now 5 invincible realm experts on their side. And the other side had fallen to the ground with tribulation. Now there were only 4 invincible realm experts. The key was that no one could control Paul's strength. Melad's heart kept sinking. He glanced around again. Arsis still didn't come over. At this time, it was enough for Arsis to go back and forth from the battlefield to the church twice. But Arsis hadn't appeared yet. This could only mean one thing. It wasn't that Arsis didn't want to come, but he couldn't come for the time being. Why was this happening? They lost? With such a huge advantage, did they really lose? Are you so confident? A voice suddenly rang out. Cass Rotter looked at Paul, and his voice was cold. Paul glanced at him and suddenly laughed. His voice was cold and gloomy. "You're the next one to die." Obviously, he had changed his strategy. In the situation where his side was at a disadvantage, his strategy was to kill the weakest invincible realm expert on the other side as soon as possible. The death of the 2 invincible realm experts, Mitchell and Huan Kong, was enough to prove the success of his strategy, and it was also the key to his survival until now. Now, Rothschild had a big enough advantage. Paul changed his strategy. He actually wanted to kill the strongest Cass Rotter and completely settle the battle. A crazy roar suddenly rang out. The sounds of slaughter and screams came from all directions. The elites of Rothschild, the Eastern Church, Morton, and the Violet family finally appeared on the battlefield, crazily attacking the formation of the army of Wulan State. Cass Rotter's expression was still calm. He replied to Paul with exactly the same words, confident and calm. "You're the next one to die." "What makes you think so?" Paul asked with narrowed eyes. Cass Rotter didn't say anything. However, a crimson light suddenly shone in front of him. The light kept condensing in front of him, with unparalleled spirituality and extremely fierce danger. In an instant, Paul's whole body was completely locked by an extremely cold and destructive force. Cass Rotter picked up a necklace around his neck. The necklace was small and quaint, looking like a cross. But all the red light was emitted from the cross, and the small cross was changing shape, growing larger and longer. Cass Rotter held the cross, his face grave and solemn. The constantly changing necklace finally turned into an exaggeratedly big gun. It was called a gun, but the muzzle was as big as the muzzle of a cannon. Countless rays of red light were constantly condensing in the muzzle, which looked extremely strange. Cass Rotter pointed the gun at Paul and said calmly, "That's it." Paul stopped laughing. His eyes were fixed on the gun in Cass Rotter's hand. Holy punishment of void. He said word by word. Holy punishment of void, one of the 12 murderous weapons in the dark world, was also the only murderous weapon in North America. The red light kept converging. Cass Rotter put his finger on the trigger. Looking at Paul, who was so close that he could not avoid it, he said calmly, "Goodbye." Paul tightened his body and pulled King Tong back quickly without hesitation. Cass Rotter smiled and slowly exerted force with his fingers. Suddenly, another hand appeared on the barrel of the void godly punishment. The extremely hard palm directly blocked the muzzle of the holy punishment of void. Cass Rotter's pupils suddenly shrank. An extremely strange figure suddenly appeared in front of him. The other party was also emitting scarlet light, which almost merged with the light of the holy punishment of void. Cass Rotter was a little confused. But the other party's movements were extremely firm. He let go of his palm and blocked the chest of the holy punishment of void with his body. He held Cass Rotter's body with a pair of hands. Cass Rotter struggled with all his might, but he couldn't get rid of the other party's imprisonment at all. The unimaginable power completely fixed his figure in the void. Cass Rotter's eyes instantly became extremely frightened. In his sight, an expressionless face suddenly became extremely clear. In the red light all over the sky, the other party said calmly, "Die." His body directly crashed into Cass Rotter, and one of his hands directly pressed against Cass Rotter's palm. Boom! The red light all over the sky suddenly exploded. In the chaos of Eastern Europe, for the first time, a murderous weapon opened fire directly. Countless rays of death exploded in the nearest distance and completely enveloped Cass Rotter. Suddenly, there was a rain of blood in the air. The red light was still spreading and entangling in the air. Vaguely, an object emitting red light fell down and landed in the rain on the ground. A figure walked over and bent down to pick up the object that had fallen into the water. It was an eyeball. The eyeball had not been opened, so the light in the pupil was extremely weak. The figure held the eyeball and looked at it silently for a while. In the rain of blood all over the sky, he opened his mouth and directly ate the eyeball. Chapter 507. For everyone in the dark world, the night of August 17th was destined to be extremely long. The constantly changing situation affected everyone's heart. In the office of the president, the chaos of the situation even diluted Li Tianlan's surprise at Qin Weibai's sudden arrival. Li Tianlan's expression was still calm. But his heart kept falling with the changing situation, as if he had fallen from heaven to hell, from summer to winter. The screen in front of him was filled with red light. The murderous weapon in North America, the holy punishment of void, had been silent for a long time. This time, Cass Rotter fired with all his might, and its lethality could be said to be at its peak. The whole night sky was completely dyed red. The heavy rain in the night was still raging, but the dark night seemed to suddenly have countless burning clouds. The incomparably gorgeous colors burned the whole sky. The red clouds kept fluttering, and the void was burned, twisted, and hollow. Li Tianlan watched this scene quietly and remained silent for a long time. At this moment, in different parts of the world, countless people were silent. The holy punishment of void did not take a long time to accumulate energy, but it was longer than the murderous weapon-setting sun of Zhongzhou State. So of course, its power was also stronger than setting Sunday. And Cass Rotter's real strength, strictly speaking, was not even as good as Gu Xingyun. It was self-evident what this meant. Everything that had happened just now was too weird. Cass Rotter took out the holy punishment of void and aimed it at Paul. A figure burning with red light could actually ignore the domain formed before the holy punishment of void was fired and directly appeared in front of Cass Rotter. This was weird enough. But what was even more incomprehensible was that the moment the other party appeared in front of Cass Rotter was completely controlled by the other party without any ability to resist. So Cass Rotter detonated the murderous weapon. In front of him, this shot could even be said to have been fired at himself. Why did this happen? The only reasonable explanation was that the other party was stronger than Cass Rotter. The person who could control Cass Rotter the moment he got close to him should at least be a top expert at the peak of the invincible realm, such as deity, Lin Fengting, or Arsis. Such an expert had the strength to sweep the whole field. If he was properly prepared, he could also resist a blow from the murderous weapon. The other party had no reason to die with Kasrotter. But if that person was not at the peak of the invincible realm, how did he control Kasrotter? Li Tianlan's mind went blank. The red clouds that filled the sky continued to rise, burying the truth and evaporating everything. At this moment, Li Tianlan suddenly didn't want to think about anything. He did not understand how the other party had controlled Kasrotter. But that was no longer important. Most importantly, at such a close distance, the energy of the godly punishment of the void was pouring out in torrents. There was no longer any possibility of Kasrotter surviving. The god of war of Star State eventually died in Eastern Europe. From earlier, Jiang Qinyan, Black Ghost, Chaos, to tonight's Mitchell, Huan Kong, and now Kasrotter. The chaos in Eastern Europe had torn apart the lives of 6 invincible realm experts. In addition to Qin Shilai, whose life or death was unknown for the time being, there might be 7 of them. How many invincible realm experts were there in the world? But the general trend in Eastern Europe was still surging with the wind and rain, and a torrent seemed to never stop. Li Tianlan looked at the screen in front of him, but his eyes seemed to lose focus. The red glow on the screen began to dissipate. The light disappeared, and the distorted space gradually calmed down. The heavy rain fell, and it was as if nothing had happened. It seemed that something had fallen from the sky. The murderous weapon had disappeared from the place where the godly punishment of the void had just been fired. Kasrotter had also disappeared. It was as if he had never existed. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes tightly. The power in the field had been presented in the most obvious manner. Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, and Hastile. Raphael, Situt Sangyue, and Mellad. 8 invincible realm experts. Strictly speaking, Mellad was just Li Tianlan's partner. The Vatican could change its position at any time. So strictly speaking, only Situt Sangyue and Raphael were on Li Tianlan's side at this time. Li Tianlan could not hear Paul's words. But he knew that he had lost. From the very beginning, he had the upper hand. But now, the situation had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Everything that Li Tianlan had done tonight could be said to be a real failure. And the most fatal loophole in all this was that their side had seriously underestimated Paul's strength. After joining hands with King Tong, Paul could be said to be a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm. He alone had stalled several invincible realm experts for too long, which directly overturned everything that Li Tianlan had carefully prepared. He turned the situation around with his own strength. This was the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. All the unwillingness in his heart seemed to turn into a flame in his body. His whole body seemed to be on fire, but his expression was terrifyingly calm. "It's my mistake," Qin Weibai, who had been sitting next to Li Tianlan, suddenly said. The estimation of Paul's strength was completely provided by the Samsara Palace. According to the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, Paul's current strength should be able to enter the divine list, but it was slightly inferior to King Tong's. But the actual situation was a little wrong. With the strength that Paul had shown tonight, even 2 King Tongs were not as good as Paul. The mistake in the intelligence directly led to everything that happened tonight. Otherwise, everything would have gone smoothly tonight. "It's not your fault." Li Tianlan shook his head. Tonight's mistake seemed to be because of the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, but it also made Li Tianlan realize his own flaws. At this moment, Li Tianlan finally admitted that no matter how perfect his willpower was in martial arts, he was still a little impetuous in the general trend. It was not a mistake to trust the intelligence of the Samsara Palace. The biggest mistake was that his plan was too crazy. Crazy meant extreme rash. He went forward with indomitable will, leaving no room for leeway. Such a plan often meant that he could master everything perfectly. So when Paul's strength exceeded his expectations, the whole plan had been completely out of control. It was doomed to fail. Doomed? Li Tianlan asked himself subconsciously. Is it really doomed? The moment this question came up, he asked himself again. There's still a chance. Li Tianlan suddenly said. Of course. Qin Weibai chuckled and said softly, Tianlan, do you know Sun Tzu's art of war? Most of the time, the more complicated and unfavorable the situation is, the more we have to deal with it in the simplest way. Tonight in Reki City, you can do whatever you want, regardless of victory or defeat. Li Tianlan didn't speak. He just glanced at the screen again. There was no room for his plan. But in fact, there was a lot of room. When Qin Shilai in tribulation withdrew from the battlefield, and Raphael and Situ Tsanyue were not in their peak state, Li Tianlan still had a trump card that he hadn't used. He himself hadn't moved yet. In today's complicated and unfavorable situation, the simplest way was for him to rush over with the elites of the Snowdance Corps. He would face Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, and Hastile. The incomparably huge pressure surged over like a mountain or a sea. Li Tianlan's eyes were quiet and deep. I can't lose, he said softly. He couldn't, and he was unwilling. Everything that happened tonight should have had a very perfect ending in his plan. But if the situation continued to develop, in the case of a crushing defeat, not to mention a perfect ending, even the advantage that Li Tianlan had built in Reki City would be completely ruined. The chaos in Eastern Europe might not end tonight, but after tonight, the overall situation was bound to become clear. At this critical moment, if Li Tianlan admitted defeat and left Reki City, there would be no place for the Snowdance Corps in all of Eastern Europe. If he returned to Zhongzhou State with such a result, the future of him and the Li family would become bleak. Li Tianlan was now like a gambler who knew he would lose but couldn't afford to lose at all. His eyes were red, and he almost lost his mind and wanted to bet everything he had. Li Tianlan was looking at the screen. Qin Weibai was looking at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan didn't move. But Qin Weibai clearly noticed that there was a kind of unwillingness in him, struggling, burning, and finally becoming crazy and hysterical. Her eyes were gentle and affectionate, but there was a trance in the depths of her eyes. It seemed that in the memory of a long, long time ago, but also as if it was yesterday, there was also a man who had amazed the whole dark world. In the face of a great dilemma, he was silent, struggling, and crazy. At that time, she was still very naive and childish. Thus, she watched as the man walked into a predicament in silence, walked into a hopeless situation, and finally buried everything he had. The memory passed through the quiet years and was shrouded in light. Li Tianlan's figure seemed to be merging with the memory, and they were inseparable. Qin Weibai suddenly laughed. She reached out and put her palm in Li Tianlan's hand. Nothing is perfect, she said softly, but there is nothing that can't be made up for. Tianlan, you won't lose. Her voice was gentle and firm. Today, tonight. She was Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan's woman. Now she was not naive or childish. She had the real qualification to stand by Li Tianlan's side. Li Tianlan might not be perfect now. But Qin Weibai firmly believed that standing by Li Tianlan's side was Li Tianlan's perfection. The intelligence of Samsara Palace could be wrong. She could also make mistakes. But she would not allow herself to fail. The silver bracelet on Li Tianlan's left hand lit up. The sword intent was extremely abundant, and the light on the silver bracelet shone more brightly. This sword, Qin Weibai looked at the silver light on Li Tianlan's wrist and whispered, "It's not perfect. Even if it's not perfect, I still have to use it." Li Tianlan whispered. The silver edge spread in his hand. Falling stars was the first choice in his hand. However, at this moment, some subtle cracks had appeared on the silver blade of falling stars. Li Tianlan looked at the cracks on the blade and remained silent. The spirituality is not enough, the sword energy is not strong, and the sword body is also incomplete. Since it's not perfect, then don't use it. Qin Weibai looked at Li Tianlan. There was a very obvious hesitation in her eyes, but she finally made up her mind. She said with a smile, Tianlan, how about I give you a sword? Li Tianlan was a little confused. What kind of sword? Of course, it's a real magic weapon that is most suitable for you and worthy of your future. Qin Weibai stared at Li Tianlan's face, and her eyes were a little sad. She turned her head and glanced at the screen. On the screen, the red light all over the sky completely dissipated. It was late at night. Qin Weibai suddenly asked, Tianlan, do you know how the people of the devil troop just controlled Cass Rotter? Chapter 508. The Devil Troop. Although he had a hunch in his heart, Li Tianlan still felt a little cold when he heard Qin Weibai's words. The Devil Troop was the most mysterious force of the Wang family of Beihai. It was also the trump card that Wang Tianzong could still play in Reki City even though he was imprisoned tonight. But Li Tianlan had never known what the Devil Troop was. So in his uneasiness and anxiety, the sudden appearance of the Devil Troop gave him an absolute surprise, and then disappeared in an instant. The way the other party perished together was extremely tragic. But Cass Rotter's death also completely determined Li Tianlan's defeat tonight. This surprise was absolutely important to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. The Devil Troop. Who the hell are they? They are a group of monsters that are neither alive nor dead, Qin Weibai said softly. Their state is very special, and their bodies are even more special, so they can control murderous weapons. Li Tianlan vaguely understood. He looked at Qin Weibai and asked, can they control murderous weapons? The death of Cass Rotter has proved this. Qin Weibai said, at the moment when the holy punishment of void was fired, it was not Cass Rotter who was really controlled, but the holy punishment of void. To be more precise, it was the murderous weapons that rebelled, which eventually caused Cass Rotter's death. The holy punishment of void was controlled. The murderous weapons rebelled. Li Tianlan looked at Qin Weibai as if he were listening to a fantasy story. Murderous weapons can also rebel? Dongqing Rushi came over and asked curiously. The murderous weapons themselves are a kind of living metal. They have their own intelligence, so they are extremely powerful. However, we can't understand this kind of life form for the time being, so we can only make use of their power. Qin Weibai said, anything with intelligence and life can betray us. But it's not easy. Li Tianlan suddenly said. Qin Weibai nodded. But for the Wang family of Beihai, it's not necessarily difficult. Tianlan, you should have heard that the 13 murderous weapons come from the same piece of life metal. And this piece of life metal was obtained by the ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai after he defeated a strong opponent. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Qin Weibai's voice was a little cold. Murderous weapons have lives. It's not easy to make murderous weapons rebel. But since they have lives, they naturally have thoughts. What if the holy punishment of the void thought that the people of the Devil Troop were their own kind at that moment? Li Tianlan suddenly raised his head and looked at Qin Weibai, his eyes burning. Qin Weibai's tone was calm, as if she was talking about the simplest fact. The murderous weapon can make the murderous weapon think that the other person is its own kind. Naturally, there are a few fragments of the murderous weapon in the body of every person in the Devil Troop. You mean? Li Tianlan's voice suddenly became unprecedentedly dry. Every member of the Devil Troop is a murderous weapon? In essence, every member of the Devil Troop was once an invincible realm expert of the Wang family of Beihai. Their bodies will age and their realms will decline, but in order to protect the Wang family of Beihai, they willingly accepted the transformation of the Wang family of Beihai. This transformation is very complicated, and the most important thing is the implantation of the murderous weapon fragments. The implantation of the murderous weapon fragments will integrate the spirituality of the fragments with their physical skills, so that their bodies will always be alive. After that, the Wang family of Beihai should take measures similar to freezing and completely seal these people. They will die. Dongqing Rushi suddenly said seriously. Qin Weibai glanced at her and nodded. The Wang family of Beihai has the immortality potion. The reason why the production of the immortality potion is rare is that several of the medicines are hard to find in the world. But the rarest materials are not for making the immortality potion. Do you understand? For example, to make a pure immortality potion, it needs about 60 kinds of precious materials, but to make a finished immortality potion, it needs 80 kinds of materials. The latter 20 kinds of materials are added to neutralize some of the side effects of the immortality potion. Without these 20 kinds of materials, it is also the immortality potion with the same massive vitality, or even more powerful, but it is also a kind of poison that can make people doomed eternally. After adding the latter 20 kinds of medicines, the immortality potion is the most precious immortality potion, because it has no side effects and can be taken by people. But for the devil troop, what they need is the simplest immortality potion, which is vitality. This kind of medicine combined with the frozen environment can keep their bodies alive for a long time. But the poison of the immortality potion will gradually make them lose all their memories. The spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality will combine with each other and turn them into monsters that will only obey orders. They don't feel pain, and they don't even have much thinking. Their only goal is to complete the task. They used to be experts of the invincible realm in the Wang family of Beihai. Even if their martial arts have degenerated over a long time, their bodies will always be close to the peak state under the stimulation of the immortality potion. Under such circumstances, the realm they show may be the fire-flaming realm or the thunder-shocking realm, but it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that their defense, speed, and even strength are all in the invincible realm. This is the devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai. The Wang family of Beihai replaced people's souls with the spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality of the immortality potion, turning the former experts of the invincible realm into war machines that can only fight by instinct. That's why the holy punishment of Void regarded the devil troop as its own kind and betrayed Kasrotter. Li Tianlan took a deep drag on the cigarette. The thick smoke poured into his lungs, and he suddenly coughed violently. Dongqing Rushi and Qin Weibai's delicate palms fell on Li Tianlan's back almost at the same time. Qin Weibai took a glass of water and handed it to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan drank up the water in the quilt. After a moment of silence, he asked, "How many of such devil troop does the Wang family of Beihai have?" "I don't know the exact number. But it won't be less than 20. The oldest devil troop has even been sleeping for hundreds of years. As far as I know, the Wang family of Beihai once used the devil troop on Mount Dibbing more than 20 years ago. At that time, 12 of them were dispatched. If I'm not mistaken, the ones who came to Eastern Europe this time should also be these 12. Qin Weibai said softly, "The vitality of the immortality potion is the most effective when it is frozen. Otherwise, how can they survive for hundreds of years?" In the eyes of the Wang family of Beihai, the devil troop is the most luxurious consumable. They used it once more than 20 years ago. Even if it was frozen immediately, the damage to their vitality should be very serious. When the devils enter the human world, they won't live for long. This time, Wang Tianzong should want to use them all in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan nodded and took a deep look at the screen. The battlefield on the screen once again became extremely chaotic. However, the situation had been completely reversed from before. Raphael and Situ Tsangye had already met up. Mellad also approached them. Outside them, 5 invincible realm experts, Paul, King Tong, Lagos, Hastile, and Violet, were frantically besieging 3 invincible realm experts. On the ground, the elites of Rothschild finally arrived at the battlefield, followed by the elites of Morton and the Violet family. The streets were in a mess, and the war was everywhere. Li Tianlan stood up and looked at the screen. His eyes gradually became sharp. "There's still a chance." Qin Weibai said softly, "As long as Arcis and Charlemagne arrive at the battlefield, there is still hope to turn the situation around. I won't wait any longer." Li Tianlan suddenly said, "If we wait any longer, they won't be able to hold on." Charlemagne and Arcis hadn't arrived yet. But they would definitely arrive. The situation tonight had been delayed by Paul until now. Paul would definitely know better than anyone that it would be equally disadvantageous for them to delay. Therefore, although Paul had just consumed a lot of physical strength, his attack at this time was still extremely fierce. Situ Xianxia couldn't hold on any longer. Raphael couldn't hold on either. "I'll go," Li Tianlan said, as if he was talking to himself. He nodded and repeated, "Well, I'll go." Dongqing Rushi opened her mouth subconsciously. She glanced at Qin Weibai and fell silent again. Li Tianlan would definitely join this battlefield. But compared to the plan, it was much earlier, and the risk was much higher. "You should do what you want to do." Qin Weibai walked up to Li Tianlan, reached out to touch his face, and said softly, "Don't worry, you will win, as long as you are willing to do your best." "Of course." Li Tianlan laughed. He directly turned off the screen in front of him. There was no point in watching it. If he couldn't make a comeback tonight, the advantage of Reki City would disappear, everything they had in Eastern Europe would not exist, and the future of the Li family would not exist either. So he couldn't afford to lose. He had to win. Li Tianlan held Qin Weibai's hand that was stroking his face, feeling the gentleness and fragrance. He took a deep breath, looked at Dongqing Rushi again, and said calmly, "Wait for me to come back." He turned around and walked to the door. At the same time, he put on the communication device in the Snowdance core and said blandly, "Gather." In an instant, the entire office of the president was in motion. The room became extremely quiet. Dongqing Rushi looked at Qin Weibai quietly. Qin Weibai was also looking at Dongqing Rushi. After a long time, she seemed to have confirmed something, and her eyes became softer. "Sister, should we wait for him to come back?" Dongqing Rushi suddenly asked. "You have to wait." Qin Weibai whispered, "I won't wait." "Why?" Dongqing Rushi asked subconsciously. "I'm going to Jianghu State," Qin Weibai said. Qin Weibai said, "I just said that I will give Tianlan a real magic weapon, one that can match his future sword intent." "Is there really such a sword?" Dongqing Rushi was a little doubtful. There were too many famous swords in the world with unparalleled sharpness, but they were dead objects after all. In Kendo, the sword energy was either sharp or ethereal, and it moved according to one's heart. Therefore, after the Invincible Realm, every Invincible Realm expert in Kendo wanted to find a famous sword that could perfectly carry his sword intent. Silence in Dongqing Rushi's hand was one. Sharpness of the Qin clan in Eastern Europe was also one. As for the peak of the Invincible Realm in the Dark World, almost no famous sword could carry their sword intent perfectly. When they reached the peak of the Invincible Realm, they needed swords with intelligence. That was, murderous weapons. Falling Stars in Li Tianlan's hand could almost be regarded as the ultimate sword. In terms of sharpness, Falling Stars might not be sharper than famous swords like Listen to the Sea, Sharpness, and Silence. It might even be a little worse. But in terms of intelligence, Falling Stars was far better than other famous swords. But Li Tianlan's sword intent was also extremely strong. Qin Weibai said that there was a divine weapon worthy of Li Tianlan's future. Li Tianlan was destined to surpass the peak of the Invincible Realm in the future and become the Chosen One. What kind of sword could perfectly carry the sword intent of the Chosen One? Dongqing Rushi couldn't imagine the sharpness of that sword at all. "Yes." Qin Weibai said softly, "In Jianghu State, in Lin'an." Dongqing Rushi looked at Qin Weibai and was silent for a while. Then, she was a little hesitant, and there was undisguised worry in her clear eyes. "What should we do here tonight?" Qin Weibai looked at her and seemed to think for a moment. Then she chuckled and said, "Tonight, very good." "What's good about it?" Dongqing Rushi thought about the situation shown on the screen just now and asked without relaxing. The current situation was extremely obvious. There were only Situ Xianxia and Raphael on their side. Paul, on the other hand, was infinitely close to the peak of the Invincible Realm. Even if Arceus could really arrive in time, Charlemagne of the Heroes Club would also take action, and their side would no longer have an overwhelming advantage. At best, it could only be said that there was a chance. Dongxing Rushi's heart moved slightly, and she asked carefully and softly, "Sister, do you have any other arrangements for Reki City tonight?" "No." Qin Weibai smiled and said, "Everything tonight is Tianlan's plan. His plan conflicts with mine, so I changed my mind. But Tianlan's plan is not perfect." Dongxing Rushi was silent for a while, and then said softly, "There are indeed loopholes in his plan, but in terms of the general trend, it is already perfect. Don't worry about some flaws." Qin Weibai's eyes were a little dazed, as if she had seen Li Tianlan's situation. He stood in a desperate situation where he thought there was no way out, but he didn't know that there was a greater force behind him. Qin Weibai thought quietly, and her eyes were calm. She was the greatest perfection in Li Tianlan's life. But tonight, Li Tianlan's perfection was not her. That night was the trial day. But tonight had greatly deviated from the original plan. The trial was still going on. But it was no longer the trial day that belonged to her. Qin Weibai came to her senses, smiled, and said, "I'm leaving." Dongxing Rushi wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "You." Qin Weibai walked over, tidied Dongxing Rushi's hair, and said softly, "Don't let your imagination run wild. Tianlan will be fine. You, me, Yuetong, and Tianlan, we are destined to be together." Dongxing Rushi blushed, bit her lip, and didn't speak. Qin Weibai took a deep look at her, turned around, and left. "Sister." Dongxing Rushi's voice suddenly sounded. Qin Weibai stopped where she was and didn't look back. "You came today." Dongxing Rushi suddenly felt a little confused. "Did you just pass by?" If Samsara Palace really didn't have any arrangement for everything tonight, then why did Qin Weibai appear here? "No." Qin Weibai smiled and said, "I came to see Wang Tianzong." Wang Tianzong was still drinking tea, and he was not sleepy at all. The water in the teapot had been changed twice, but the fragrance was still there. He held the cup and sipped, and his mind seemed to be completely immersed in his own world. Wang Tianzong was very focused in this state. It was like meditation. When Qin Weibai walked into the room, Wang Tianzong was holding the teapot and pouring water. His silhouette was reflected in her line of sight, looking incomparably lofty and lonely. "The tea is good," Qin Weibai said. Wang Tianzong said yes and said, "Have a taste?" "Okay." Qin Weibai came over and sat opposite Wang Tianzong. The tea was the tea that Li Tianlan had drunk. Wang Tianzong added a small amount of special potion in it. However, this kind of potion that could distract people had no effect on her. In the spiritual field, Qin Weibai was not yet in the transcendent realm. But she was definitely the person closest to the transcendent realm. "Why are you here?" Wang Tianzong asked. His emotions didn't fluctuate, only calmness. If Qin Weibai didn't come tonight or came a little later, maybe a lot of things would have happened now. Maybe Li Tianlan would have cooperated with him now. Maybe the pattern of Zhongzhou state and the dark world for the next 100 years would be determined tonight. There were many maybes. Wang Tianzong felt a little regretful, but he was not angry. "You're hurting him," Wang Tianzong said softly, and his tone was a little emotional. He really felt that it was a pity. Until now, he thought that it was the best choice for Li Tianlan to enter the Wang family of Beihai and Wang Yuetong to be the patriarch. Qin Weibai seemed a little confused. She looked at Wang Tianzong and suddenly asked, "Your Majesty, do you really think it's a good thing for Tianlan to join the Wang family of Beihai?" Wang Tianzong was a little silent. After a while, he said slowly, "At least for me and him, this is the best situation." Qin Weibai smiled. Her smile was a little cold, but it was still perfect and exquisite, with a kind of charm that could topple a country. "It's the best for you," she said softly. "It's not too bad for Tianlan personally. But now he is more than just him. Some things should have been abandoned long ago." Wang Tianzong looked cold and waved his hand. Qin Weibai didn't seem to want to dwell on this topic. She drank a cup of tea and said softly, "He's the best when I'm with him." When she said this, she didn't show off or be arrogant, only endless softness. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. "I came here today just to see His Majesty." Qin Weibai shook her head and answered Wang Tianzong's original question. "I don't know if I should be surprised or disappointed with His Majesty's current state." Her eyes were bright and calm, and her gaze was extremely sharp. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. His eyes were a little dignified, but at this time, there was a little more smile. The Wang family of Beihai has never let anyone down. Wang Tianzong said with a smile, "The sword of Beihai is the same. The sword of Beihai is really sharp and unparalleled." Qin Weibai replied meaningfully. Wang Tianzong's pupils shrank slightly. For a long time, he didn't speak. "I heard that the Wang family of Beihai is forging swords. His Majesty should be preparing for his own breakthrough and wants a divine weapon that can carry your sword intent, right?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. Wang Tianzong's eyes narrowed tightly, and a trace of gloom flashed in the depths of his eyes. The Wang family of Beihai forged swords. The coldness of 9 states. This matter was the top secret of the top secrets in the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Tianzong knew it. Summer Solstice knew it. In addition, only a few sword-forging staff knew it. No one would tell this news. The question was, how did Qin Weibai know it? How is the progress of the divine weapon? Qin Weibai's tone was straightforward and calm. How is His Majesty's current state? Wang Tianzong seemed to have completely calmed down and said indifferently, "Not far away." Qin Weibai nodded and said, "I also have a sword. I want to see the peerless divine weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. Now it seems that it is not the right time." "Don't worry." Wang Tianzong laughed. "You know the coldness of 9 states, but you are still so confident. So, I also want to see how your so-called divine weapon is. In the chaos of Eastern Europe, you will see me and the coldness of 9 states." The coldness of 9 states, Qin Weibai said to herself in a somewhat complicated tone. She slowly put down the teacup and said calmly, "In this case, I will wait for the Wang family of Beihai to shine the brightest in hundreds of years." She stood up. After a few words, she had already planned to leave. Wang Tianzong looked at her back with some surprise. "So soon?" Qin Weibai's figure paused. She turned to look at Wang Tianzong and said calmly, "As I said, I came here tonight to see you. As long as you can't break through tonight, I can temporarily leave Eastern Europe with peace of mind. At present, it seems that you have no possibility of breaking through tonight, so you can't get involved in what happens outside the Caesar Hotel." "Oh," Wang Tianzong said. He looked up at his watch. Now, he looked at Qin Weibai seriously. "I don't think the battle in front of the Caesar Hotel is optimistic, right? Rothschild may be passive at first, but now, how many of your allies have died?" Mitchell, Chaos, Cass Rotter. Qin Weibai told the truth. Tribulation and Qin Shilai have withdrawn from the battlefield. 5 people are missing. Wang Tianzong nodded. "When will Samsara Palace take action?" "Of course, when you break through." Qin Weibai answered without hesitation. "So, the master of Samsara Palace is really not dead?" Wang Tianzong thought of some rumors, narrowed his eyes, and hid all his emotions. Qin Weibai did not speak. Not speaking was a tacit agreement. "It doesn't matter." Wang Tianzong was silent for a while and said blandly, "After tonight, the general trend will be changed. Tianlan is destined to ruin his advantage in Reki City tonight. I'm here now, but I won't wait until dawn. I will become the master here." "The master here?" Qin Weibai couldn't help laughing. "Your Majesty, do you think Tianlan will lose?" "The situation is already obvious." Wang Tianzong asked, "How can he win?" "Indeed, the situation is already obvious." Qin Weibai nodded. "But I have a question. You know Rothschild's allies, their lineup, and Paul's strength. Naturally, you have also expected the scene in front of the Caesar Hotel. In this case, why did you show your bottom line to Tianlan before? Why did you want to protect Paul and King Tong? The muscles at the corners of Wang Tianzong's eyes twitched, and he suddenly fell silent. Your Majesty, the situation is so obvious. Tell me, how can Tianlan lose? Qin Weibai was aggressive. You know everything that happened tonight. Even the current scene is meaningless. From the moment you were placed under house arrest here, Tianlan had already won. Several allies died, and 2 invincible realm experts withdrew from the battlefield. Even if Raphael and Situ Tsanyue all died here, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, as long as Tianlan was still here, he would not lose. Qin Weibai looked at Wang Tianzong. You know this better than anyone else. As long as you don't make a breakthrough, Tianlan is truly invincible in Reki City tonight. Lose? Do you think it's possible? Wang Tianzong was still silent. His silence was also a tacit agreement. If he didn't make a move tonight, Li Tianlan would be invincible in the world. Very few people know this. But this was the truth. Perhaps Li Tianlan himself didn't know that his current disadvantage was meaningless to Rothschild. As Qin Weibai said, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, even if all the invincible realm experts on his side withdrew from the battlefield, even if all the invincible realm experts standing beside him rebelled, as long as he was still there, he could use the most powerful means to save all this. Wang Tianzong knew this. That was why he showed his bottom line in advance. Tonight, do you want to go to war with the whole dark world? Wang Tianzong suddenly asked. In my plan, there should be some time before this night. That is the real trial day. Everyone is guilty. I will use all my strength to judge the whole dark world. Qin Weibai said calmly, but Tianlan started his plan first. I can only take a step back. His plan may not be mature enough, but it doesn't matter. A plan with a 100% success rate doesn't need the so-called maturity and correction. So tonight's trial day is the trial of the Li family. Your Majesty, you are imprisoned here. I should congratulate you for escaping. Although it's only temporary. The meaning of this sentence couldn't be more obvious. If Li Tianlan hadn't planned the war in front of the Caesar Hotel tonight, as time went by, if the real trial day was planned by Qin Weibai, even Wang Tianzong was bound to die. Wang Tianzong shook his head with a smile. You are very confident. It's just a fact. Qin Weibai said blandly, after tonight, the chaos in Eastern Europe can basically end, but I am still looking forward to the final ending. I am looking forward to your Majesty's breakthrough and the sharpness of the coldness of 9 states. Tianlan will make the most complicated situation simple. In the last and simplest situation, I will personally end the glory of the Wang family of Beihai. After the trial, it was not the end. Wang Tianzong would not be willing to end it. When the trial was over, there must be an end. Wang Tianzong stopped talking and turned around again. Qin Weibai continued to move forward. She opened the door and walked out. A slight but pervasive sword intent suddenly rose in the room. The sword intent tore the window lattice in front of Wang Tianzong. The wind and rain poured in, and it was a little cold. Wang Tianzong held the teacup and looked out of the window quietly. Heaven and earth were long. The night rain was boundless. His eyes were deep and cold, and eventually became the most complete silence. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.